Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to begin our conversation about the Industrial Revolution. As always, there are some key terms and ideas that you should be able to track by the time we get to the last slide in this lecture. There are also some questions that you should be able to answer by the time you get to the end of the lecture as well. So let's get to it. So what was the Industrial Revolution? Well, according to Jackson Spielvogel, quote, it was a shift from a traditional labor-intensive economy based on farming and handicrafts to a more capital-intensive economy based on manufacturing by machines, specialized labor, and industrial factories, end quote. But what does this mean? Well, let's break it down just a little bit. Let's start with the first part of this definition. A shift from a traditional, labor-intensive economy based on farming and handicrafts. Well, you can obviously see here, what I want to highlight is labor-intensive. Before the Industrial Revolution, most work was done by hand. It was done by human beings with the help of animals. It was highly labor-intensive, and it also was not very efficient. For example, in the year 1750, the labor ratio was 8 to 10. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that it took 8 people working 12-hour days to produce enough food and clothing to supply 10 people. That's a very labor-intensive economy. It takes a lot of labor to provide food and clothing for not very many people. Moreover, most people in Western civilization lived on farms or in tiny villages. Large cities were still quite rare in Western civilization. Moreover, manufacturing was largely done in the home. There were no such things as factories. Instead, manufacturing was done in what was called cottage industries. To make extra money, families would agree to do a specific part of the manufacturing process in their own home or cottage. For example, cotton might be carded in one home. It might be spun into thread in another home, and then woven into cloth in yet another home. Now you can guess that it was hard to produce goods in much volume in cottage industries. This is going to begin to change in the 1770s and the 1780s, when machines operating in huge urban factories took over more and more of the work. Most of these factories were built in large cities. Thus, millions of people left the farms and villages and moved to the cities. But what drove the Industrial Revolution? How did it work? Well, first of all, it all began in the 1770s in Great Britain. Why Great Britain? Well, one reason is that Britain had a large population due to the Agricultural Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution produced more food, and more food meant more people. More people meant increased demand for food and clothing and other manufactured goods. In other words, more people needed more stuff. Another reason why Great Britain was the first to experience the Industrial Revolution had to do with its government. Remember, Great Britain was not an absolutist monarchy. It was a constitutional monarchy. In an absolutist state, it could be impossible for people to innovate or try new ideas, simply because everything was being directed by the monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy or in a non-absolutist state, there was more freedom to experiment and to try new things and new ideas. That's going to benefit Great Britain. Finally, while most of Europe had been tearing itself apart from 1793 till 1815, Great Britain was largely left to itself. While it fought in the Napoleonic Wars, its territory was never invaded, nor was its economy seriously disrupted. The first area to industrialize was the textile industry. The textile industry was all about making cloth. A growing population in Great Britain demanded more cloth for clothing. The colonies were also producing more cotton that could be used for cloth. The problem was that the cottage industry simply could not turn that cotton into cloth fast enough to meet demand. The problem was solved in 1769 with the first water-powered spinning machine. In other words, you have a mechanized machine, a mechanized production of thread production, which created a new problem. Now there was plenty of cotton thread, but weaving that thread into cloth was still done by hand. The solution will be in 1785, the creation of a water-powered loom. In other words, now we're mechanizing the weaving of thread into cloth. This is going to be the pattern for the Industrial Revolution. A problem will arise, and someone will invent a machine to solve that problem, which will lead to another problem and another solution, and so on, etc., etc. The next major innovation was to replace water power with steam power. Steam engines could do harder and heavier work than any human or animal could accomplish. Humanity now had unlimited power at its disposal, and they soon learned how to put it to use in industries. Steam engines, for example, could pump water from mines. Steam engines could run mechanized weaving and spinning machines. Steam engines could power flour mills. They could run iron mills. In short, there seemed to be nothing that steam engines could not do. Now, another problem will arise during the Industrial Revolution. The next problem is getting rid of the stuff that the Industrial Revolution was creating. Industrialization requires a steady and growing market of consumers because you're producing lots and lots more stuff. And so you have to be able to sell that stuff to more and more people. Now, Great Britain had that growing market. The population boom continued into the 19th century. The problem was you had to be able to get the stuff to the people. So let me just rephrase this. Great Britain, the Industrial Revolution makes it possible to make more stuff. To make a profit off of that stuff, you have to be able to sell it to the population, to the people. Now, Great Britain had lots of people. The problem was you needed to be able to get the stuff from the factories to the population that wanted that stuff. The solution is going to be the railroad. Railroads were powered by steam engines, and they ran on iron rails. By 1830, the rocket, one of the first railroads built in Great Britain, could move at a lightning speed of 16 miles per hour over 32 miles of track. Now, why are railroads so important? Well, railroads made it possible to easily transport people and stuff over long distances. Thus, a factory producing shoes, for example, no longer had to rely on the immediate area to buy those shoes. They could sell them to people hundreds, if not thousands of miles away. That meant common people were able to afford things that they might not have been able to afford before. Now, another impact of the Industrial Revolution will be population growth. Great Britain's population, for example, in 1780 will be about 8 million people. By 1850, well into the Industrial Revolution, it will be 18 million people. It's more than doubled in size. By 1880, just 30 years later, it will be at 26 million people. Now, this is going to transform society. As I've said, really, the Industrial Revolution will completely transform society because not only will it allow for a population boom, not only will it allow for the creation of more stuff, it's going to completely reshape Western civilization. How? Well, one thing is simply the fact that the Industrial Revolution makes it possible to produce more manufactured goods at lower prices. This means also that more people can have basic necessities. More people will be able to afford basic things that they couldn't have afforded before. Things that might have been luxuries, like a second pair of shoes, are now affordable for more of the population. But there is a downside to the Industrial Revolution for a large portion of the population. One significant change was the growth of cities. As I said, the population of Great Britain grows significantly during the Industrial Revolution. Much of that growth is going to occur in cities. Before the Industrial Revolution, society was overwhelmingly rural. Factories, however, were typically built in cities. Factories meant jobs, and jobs drew people away from the countryside. Within a century, Western civilization had become far, far, far more urban. Take Great Britain, for example. The city of London had 1 million people in 1800. However, in the rest of the nation, there were only 6 cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000. So in other words, most people in Great Britain in the year 1800 still lived in the countryside. They still lived in rural areas. The Industrial Revolution is going to change that. By 1850, 50% of the British population lived in cities. That's a huge transformation. Now, such rapid growth is going to come with problems. Typically, there weren't enough buildings to house all of those people. What apartment buildings that did exist were poorly made and way overcrowded. Take this description of a working class apartment building. The courts of working class row houses are extremely numerous. A very large portion of the poorer classes of the inhabitants reside in them. The courts vary in number of houses which they contain, from 4 to 20, and most of these houses are 3 stories high, and built as it is termed back to back. There is a wash house, an ash pit, and a privy at the end, or on one side of the court, and not infrequently one or more pigsties and heaps of manure. Generally speaking, the privies in the old courts are in the most filthy condition. Many which we have inspected were in a state which renders it impossible for us to conceive how they could be used. They were without doors and overflowing their filth. Now, just to make sure you understand, privies are outdoor bathrooms. Just picture that, what he's describing here. Nor was the work the same. Machines are expensive. Thus, they have to run day and night in order to be profitable. That meant long hours, sometimes 12 to 16-hour workdays. It also meant that factories needed a steady supply of cheap labor. And what's the cheapest labor you can find? Children. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories and in coal mines rather than attending school. This is a transformation of the Industrial Revolution, and I would say not a transformation for the better. As I said, work in these factories was incredibly difficult for everyone, not just women and children. Workdays were often between 12 and 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was no job security and no minimum wage. People could be fired at a moment's notice. If the economy, for example, went bust and the factory no longer needed to produce shoes, everyone in that factory would be laid off. They would all lose their jobs. As I said, there was no minimum wage either. People worked for pennies a day. Nor were there any special laws that protected women or children, and in fact, children were especially popular with cotton mills. As I said, children were cheap, their hands were small, they could fit into the machines, and so children were in fact a very popular form of labor within many of the factories in the Industrial Revolution. This led some to argue that workers, especially women and children, needed a protection. One such man was Michael Sadler. A member of Parliament, Sadler brought in child laborers to share their testimony with Parliament. That testimony tells us a lot about what it was like to work in the textile mills of Great Britain in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. This ultimately led to the passage of the Factory Regulations Act of 1833, a landmark piece of legislation simply because it was one of the first pieces of legislation that mandated how workers could be treated. It really applied just to children, and it said that children under 9 could not work in factories. Moreover, it said children between the ages of 9 and 13 could only work up to 9 hours a day. And again, that seems like a long day for us, but at the time, that was an improvement. Moreover, children 13 to 18 could only work 12 hours a day. Now, while limited in scope, this law does lay the groundwork for the idea that, first of all, there should be some sort of government oversight over the way factories operate. It also is going to begin the transformation of our view of childhood, and that the belief that children should be able to get an education when they are young. They should not be sent off to work in factories. So, in conclusion, the Industrial Revolution completely revolutionizes society. On the plus side, it involves the mass production of goods. These goods are being produced much more efficiently. They are much cheaper than they had been before the Industrial Revolution. This makes it possible for more people to afford more things. But there's a downside as well. Urban growth occurs so quickly. In other words, cities grow so quickly that they cannot absorb all of these new workers who are moving into them. And so you end up with buildings and apartment and neighborhoods, much like the one described earlier in this lecture. You also have the drudgery and the back-breaking labor of factory work. This is also something that is going to transform society, and it's going to take a while for government to catch up and begin regulating factories and labor. That's it. I hope this lecture was informative, and we'll continue our conversation of the Industrial Revolution in class. Thank you.